Hi everyone, I'm Kalle. I'm with DG Lab in Tokyo, usually. And I'm doing mostly Bitcoin Core stuff. Sometimes I do things that are kind of abstracted from Bitcoin Core. And today is one of those cases. So, fun fact, I don't think anyone here knows this fact. So Antpool is a miner, and Antpool is not mining RBF transactions. What I mean by that is if you RBF bump a transaction, they will ignore the second version, the high fee one. So there are cases where a transaction is RBF bumped, which just means that you increase the fee of the transaction to make it, be mined faster. So you RBF bump it, and then you have people spending the unconfirmed RBF bumped version, and you have this chain of transactions, and then the original transaction is mined, and this entire chain just evaporates. So that's an interesting fact. So anyway, today I'm going to talk about analyzing the mempool and simulating mempools and how that is useful. And so this is the agenda. It's very simple. I start with why, and then what, and we go into how I did that, and then so what. So we start with why. Back a few years ago, I was doing a presentation on scaling Stanford where I was optimistically saying we can use the mempool to get better estimation of fee rates. And then after I went off to actually try to implement that, I realized that, wait, I don't actually have a good way to compare parameters and figure out what's the optimal way to do this. Because you don't want to have something where you get a transaction that is never going to be confirmed, that you have to keep RBF pumping it and stuff. That's not what we want. We want, some kind of accuracy, anyway. So I realized there's no tools to try this out. The way I did my initial stuff was to I patched Bitcoin Core to just in real time look at the mempool and try to figure things out like that. But to get 1 day worth of data, you would have to wait 1 day, which is not very fast. So there's another thing that's happening, and that is that we're actually losing data right now. For example, we don't know when a transaction appeared. We only know when it was mined. We also don't know what happened. We don't know anything about transactions that were invalid. Like if a transaction is double spent and the other transaction is mined, then the first one is gone. There's no way to fetch that transaction from anywhere. So what I wanted was a way to record the mempool, so I can record and reproduce the exact moments inside the mempool, and just be able to play back that recording, and to do various analysis on that. So, like I said, there's lots of information, and there's also, right now, there's no good way to say, okay, so 2016, April 1st, what happened around that time? There's no good way to say that. We can just say that there were blocks X and Y were mined around that time. But we don't know, was the mempool full, or was there, how many transactions were being circulated at the time, and things like that. We also don't know, if a transaction was not mined, when did it go out of the mempool? If the mempool gets full, it starts pushing transactions out. And that could be very useful to see for, fee estimation and stuff as well. But we don't know anything about that. There's no recordings of that. And also, we don't know what people, the guys who try to deprivatize Bitcoin, we don't really know what kind of information they gain from storing the mempool data, because they probably do in private. And so having a tool to store mempool data would help us see what kind of information you can get out of that. So, for example, so you can also do, is it spam or not spam? I have a good example of this later. Miners are, what portion of transactions are mined by miners? We don't know that. But having this tool, we could say that, oh, we see that 10% of transactions being mined, we didn't know about those transactions, like consistently. So there's a new tool called MFF. Well, it's a format actually, but it has a tool as well, and that's Mempool file format, and it's kind of helps us do what I wanted to do. So it logs transactions going into and out of the mempool, like when they're being confirmed, invalidated. If a transaction is invalidated, it stores the entire raw transaction data right into the log. So you can always get that out. And when a block is mined, it will store the block. When the block is unmined, it will point that out, say that it's no longer there. And you can seek through this log file on a per block basis. So I can go to block 500,000 if I want to. But if you want to find like transaction X, that's an ON operation where N is the entire database. So that's not very optimal. And the reason I'm saying that is because this is a very specific kind of tool, format, which solves a specific task, and it's very bad in most other cases. So so anyway, so there's a library implementation of this as well. It was called BCQ, and it's built on top of another library, which is called CQDB. And those are all things I will explain a little bit about. So to kind of emphasize what I'm talking about, if you go from one side to the other, you have light clients that they store nothing and they download interesting blocks, like using Neutrino to determine that, for example. And then you can have pruned full nodes, which they keep recent blocks. You can have full nodes, which keep all confirmed blocks. And then if you have full nodes with MFF enabled, they will store all blocks. And they will also store invalidated transactions, and they will also retain the order of transactions as they go into the mempool for that particular node. So, emphasis, only confirmed transactions are currently, only confirmed blocks, the blocks in the actual chain, are kept right now. And there's no retaining of order, only the order in the block, which is not necessarily the order which transactions came into the mempool. We don't know anything. We lose permanently all invalidated transactions right now. So I have three examples of me testing this tool. The first two are not real recordings. I have a bunch of ZMQ dumps, whenever a transaction comes in, it stores the transaction. Whenever a block is mined, it stores the block hash to a big file, a text file. And I have backlogs of that from last year. As you can see, June 18th, 2018. So I have two examples, a tiny mempool and a bigger mempool. And the only reason I'm showing the first one here, the tiny mempool one, is because it's the one that's been running the longest. Creating these from CMQ dumps takes a lot of time. So some things here, this one is a little bigger than normal, so I'm going to mostly ignore it and look at this one instead. So here receives about 15 megabytes per day of data to store the mempool. That includes all the blocks and all the transactions and everything. And there's distributions about what portion in count is a transaction going into the mempool, and that turns out in this case to be 99.2%. So most operations that occur are transactions going into the mempool. And you have, for example, here you have 55,000 transactions that were invalidated. That sounds a lot, and it is. But some of that, well, most of that is RBF, because the transaction becomes invalid when it's RBF bumped. And this case here is an actual Bitcoin Core node running. As you can see, it's only been running for 5 days. But it's showing about the same, 15 megabytes per day to store this data. And the count looks mostly the same. Of note here is that there's no transactions going out of the mempool, because that only happens when the mempool is full, which is 300 megabytes. We don't have that right now. So this is not super interesting right now. But if we ever hit another one of those, mempool explosion, when a mempool explodes and things start going out of hand, we can see much better, like how did things actually behave? How could we do things to make that, to alleviate that or to address Bitcoin Core's way of dealing with that or whatever other ones you have. So of note here is that this has only been running since June 2nd, but there's a transaction here which has like 353 references, which means that it probably has a bunch of output that were spent. I will show these transactions, these 3 transactions. This one has 1,900 references from last year, so a lot of references. Anyway, I'll show these transactions later. You'll see that they're all from miners and exchanges. Anyway, so there's something called a cluster here. So what I came to realize was that if you're trying to store this data, 50 megabytes a day, like that's some gigabytes a year, you're going to run into a very unwieldy, big ass file. So what I did was I decided to just cut it up into clusters. So in this case, a cluster is 2016 blocks. It can be anything you want, really, but in my case here, that's 2016. So it's like every difficulty retargeting, there's a new cluster, and each cluster is stored in a separate file. And these are completely independent from each other, so I could throw you the cluster for blocks 500-something thousand to that plus 2016, and you would be able to get everything you wanted out of that for the transactions in that period. This is not super interesting. It's showing that if you have a smaller mempool, you get more data. And that's simply because you start having to throw things out. The distribution of the different things that's happening here. The Bitcoin Core node has so far no outputs, no transaction outs, because as I said, there's very little data yet, and mempool is not full. So this is by reference, and I will talk a little bit about what this is soon. But so the way that the data is 15 megabytes is because it's doing a bunch of tricks to keep it small. One of them is to reverse objects rather than repeating them. So a transaction is given once, and whenever it's reversed later, it will be reversed to that one, which takes like 3 bytes or something. So interest per day, this is not super interesting, but it's showing that the mempool is not very active right now. It was much more active during the period I was in the tiny mempool recording. So what I'm saying is that my middle data is more accurate, but it's not hit the snags that the first one has yet. So to take that with a grain of salt if you care. So this is one of the transactions. It's got like 2,500 outputs. It's from August 22nd, 2016. So it's an old transaction. It's been referenced like 1,900 times in 2018, between 2008 and 2018. So it's like, it still has an impact. And I think this is an exchange or a miner. There are other ones as well. This one it has a 0 fee, so it's definitely a miner, and it's 147 kilobytes. And I think all of these are over 100, no, okay, so the second and third are over 100 kilobytes, and I think that this one has a 0 fee, yeah, I think so, yeah. Okay, so how does this work? So there's 3 libraries. I'm gonna go through them quickly because I think I'm running out of time. One is CQDB, which is like a funny way of saying seekable, sequential, CQ. And that's a database and a specification. And on top of that, there's a implementation of CQDB for Bitcoin called BCQ. And then there's implementations like random command line tools and a Bitcoin Core patch, and hopefully more in the future. So CQDB is like lightweight, space and memory efficient, and it's a sequential database. So it's append only. You cannot go back and change anything. You can only add to it, and it's restricted to chronological order. So objects are stored on first reference, and then afterwards they're always referenced back. throughout a single cluster. So a tricky thing here is that when you store this data, it's just written once, and then it's never changed again. So in order to keep some kind of reference to the inside of a cluster, like where is block X, you have to have a header, and the header is actually written into the next cluster here. So so the data 1 is written, as you can see, data 1, and then header 1 is in the next cluster, in cluster 2. And then data 2 has its header in cluster 3, and so on. It's a little painful to implement, but this means you can just write once and never have to go and rewrite or recreate or do anything like that. So it's efficient in that way. And like I said, you serialize objects once, and then you use references to point at them. And you point at their byte position. So what that means is that the reader does not have to have any data in the memory. If I only have room for 10 transactions, I can throw everything out and just keep 10. And then when you tell me that there's a transaction I need to know about, I can go back and read that transaction directly by looking at the reference to it. So BCQ is just a CQDB for Bitcoin. There's nothing. So there are segments in CQDB, and each segment is corresponding to a block. You could search by segment, which is you search by block. There's 260 blocks per cluster, and objects in this case are transactions. So here is an example. You write these transactions 36E, 7F, 2F, yeah, which starts at byte position 10,000. And you write that in, and then later on you want to reference it to, so there's a block at 30,000, and you say, yeah, transaction 20,000, written as a variant like this here. This is actually not a variant, this is a compressed, but anyway. And then if you don't know this transaction, you can take the byte starting, the block starting position, you can just seek back 20,000 bytes and go to position 10,000, and you just can deserialize the transaction. So you can always get it out. And it also writes the segment information to the header, so you can seek to that segment if you want to. Right. So BCQ and CQDB and MFF are online and on GitHub, so check them out. Right, so this is a transaction that looks really weird to me. I don't know if you can probably not see what it says, but it's like all of the inputs and all of the outputs are actually the same. Well, the inputs are all the same address, and the outputs are all the same address. And this looks like spam, I think. So I looked at who made this transaction, and it turns out it's btc.com. So I asked btc.com, what are you doing? And they said, we're splitting UTXO for faster payouts. So they're saying that there's a max transaction per transaction chain size, and there's max fee. I don't know what they mean by max fee, but anyway, so they're doing this because if they don't do this, they run out of like outputs. That still doesn't explain why you would, bunch a bunch of inputs from the same transaction, but that's what they're saying anyway. So there's that. And what's it good for? Like I told you before, the Antpool thing. Like I don't think it would be possible to figure that out unless you had some kind of tool like this. It can be educational for people learning about Bitcoin. You can see exactly what does happen if I RBF bump something, or what does happen if something is double spent. For scientific purposes, it could be useful to have. Fee estimation, or like analyzing spam if you want to do that, or and also it's proved transparency, like we know what they know more precisely. So yeah, this is an example of one of the command line tools running. I know it's tiny, sorry, but this is an interesting case. So what's happening here is there's an RBF at the top. A transaction is mined, and then, a transaction comes into the mempool, then it's RBF bumped. And then later, the RBF bumped version is double spent. Which like, whoa, what's going on here? So what turns out, what's going on here is that the original transaction, the one here is like 13C7, is actually mined, it's confirmed. You can see here, 13C7 is mined. But that means if you look at the RBF rules, that's a violation of RBF rules for this other transaction because the other transaction is a higher fee. So you're not allowed to replace it in the policy, but a miner can do it anyway. So they can just take the first one. And yes, this is Antpool. If you look at the times, you will see that there's a big time to find this RBF bump version, but they don't care about it. They see this as, they see the RBF bump, they see that as a clear just double spend, and they ignore it. So anyway, that's all I have. If you have questions, I don't know how much time I have left. So.
So I have a question about transactions for Lightning Network, in particular the penalty transactions that are valid only until a certain time. So did you see any penalty transactions or any kind of these things that did not get into the blocks because of the small fees?
Because of the what?
Because the fees were too small or just miners didn't do it. So just like you want to penalize the other party that is misbehaving, but then you kind of fail to get into the block and then you're screwed.
Right. I don't know. I don't think that was a question, but yeah, okay. No. I haven't seen it yet, but yeah.
Can you repeat the question? Can you repeat the question?
So he's saying that.
Well, I think that it's about the last part. So have you seen these transactions not being included in the block during your analysis? And yeah, your answer was no.
Yeah, so I haven't seen transactions that were. Are you saying that they have too low fee? Is that what you're saying? The fee was too low? Yeah, okay. We'll talk on Twitter afterwards. Yeah.
So you mentioned an example of where Antpool had chosen the first transaction out of an RBF set.
Yeah.
And is this, so we would assume that most miners have updated to UASF compatible versions when UASF was going on, because both the SegWit2x implementation and the then UASF version were fairly up to date, and I think RBF was active in those versions. So how would you explain that Antpool is still ignoring RBF? Is there more miners that do this? Is this something you see a lot?
I think there are some people who think RBF is inherently bad, and I think that at least Beacon Core has a. I think that there is a way to turn off RBF in the settings, so you could start a Beacon Core node, which does not allow RBF. I think I could be wrong. So I would say that they're probably doing it because of ideological reasons, or they're just they downgraded they're tougher to an earlier version or something.
So another idea might be that, did you look at the latency of Antpool probably seeing something in the mempool versus inclusion?
Well, so this kind of thing happens with...
table otherwise, I guess.
What's that?
Are they leaving money on the table otherwise, I guess?
Yeah, I don't know. I just know that other miners sometimes end up doing this thing, but it's usually like within 10 seconds. So there's an RBF bump, and within 10 seconds there's a block. With Antpool, like this one here, the transaction was bumped at 4:24, and then the next block came at 4:30. So they had 5 minutes to find this transaction. I don't think any latency would be, able to explain that.
Hey, does this tool also analyze child pay for parent transactions, or?
What does it what?
See, if this tool analyzes child pays for parent transactions.
Oh, you mean the Mempool tool that I have? Yes. Yeah. Well, it doesn't analyze anything. It just writes all of the activity to disk. But you could write a tool that easily, like this here is just me just rocking settings in a silly C++ program that reads the data from disk using the BCQ library. So this is all online. You can check it out. You could grok this to do that. Yeah, for sure. You could like check how many CPFP transactions do we have. I will probably put the data that I have from 2018 online somewhere at some point. So you could go through and see like so in 2018 how many CPFPs do we have, or like yeah. You mean instead of like Beacon Core or some other node software?
No, two different places.
So
that you can check the difference.
Yes, and the mempools are like almost identical, which means
latency times and things like that.
Well, I haven't. Yeah, you're right. I should do that. But I've done where I've been looking at mempools and comparing them. But you're right. I should run the software and see how these two nodes. That's a good thing to do, I think. Well, yeah, someone should do that. Okay, I think I'm done. Thanks.